This month we're going to be moving up on shore. A few months ago I'd worked on this end of my scroll and created this crashing wave-like effect using all kinds of lace and brighter blue colors. I decided that I wanted to start and end my scroll up on land. And this month I would like to do something similar, but not exactly the same, on the other end of my scroll. So I'm going to start adding in some brighter pieces of fabric to move from those really dark inky depths of the water up onto the shoreline here. And I happen to have this piece here that fits the angle that my scroll has been cut off at the end. I don't know how that happened. It just happened to be lying there and it fit really well. So I'm going to start with this piece and I'll be just doing a regular straightforward running stitch, in out, just one row, because there will likely be other things that I add on top here as time goes by. So I just want everything stitched in place so I can work on top of them, and I can always come back in later if I decide that I want to secure these pieces of cloth down more than they are now. And I've selected a whole variety of brighter colors, brighter than the dark that I was working with for most of my scroll. And this one's really fun. It's got these stars and swirls on it. The other one has tiny little leaves on it. It doesn't really matter what the fabric patterns and designs are. I want my stitching and my work to be the focus of my piece. And these are just a colorful background. I'm doing the same thing with this. I'm using that same thread and I'm just doing a running stitch back down the other side there. And obviously this piece did not fit perfectly. That's perfectly fine. All I have to do is just trim off those extra ends and, make sure that I don't cut things off too short, and make sure that I don't cut my thread there if I want to use it some more. But even if I do, that's not really a problem. All those things can be fixed. And now I'm going to go back to that same sort of purpley, greeny, blue color piece there, and it's not quite big enough, so they're not always perfectly aligned, and that's not a problem because I can always tuck in a little piece of cloth to fill in that area there. And so once I've figured out how I want to put this in, I'll just add that on. And you'll notice that I'm not pre-planning the whole thing. I'm just doing one piece at a time. And I'll make my decisions as I go along. And I'll decide when I've got enough and when I feel like I want to stop adding pieces of cloth. And that for me is what keeps things interesting. If I plan it all out in advance and then all I'm doing is mechanically sewing things in, I personally don't find that to be as much fun as deciding what to do as I go along. But if you feel differently and you like to know exactly where you're going at the beginning before you get started, you can absolutely plan it out in advance. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to decide what I want to do about filling in that little gap there. And I think I'm just going to use a little piece off the same swirly blue cloth that I used before. I'll just cut off a little end there and fill in that area there. And I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm just doing straight running stitches to fill in that area. And now I've got this really big blank area here that's quite starkly dark, and there's nothing there, so I think I might add some more wispy little bits of color there just to add a little bit more variety. And now I've come across this little narrow piece of cloth and I've decided to add that in, just sewing it on. And now that's finished. And now off camera I've gone ahead and added a whole bunch more bits and bobs, basically in the same way as the ones that I showed you. And now I feel like it's time to start bringing in the sand area, and I just happen to have this little triangular piece here that fits quite perfectly there, and I think that's where we'll make the transition. And again, same thing, I'm just doing a regular running stitch back and forth, and this definitely is going to get covered up. And I have something in mind for this area, so I know that there's going to be many more stitches over this area, so it doesn't really need to be very secure at all. It just needs to be attached, so can do a little bit more stitch magic in this area. So I'll just go back and forth, and sometimes just rocking my needle back and forth, and sometimes just taking one stitch at a time till I get to the end here. So now I want to create the look of some waves coming up towards the shorelines. So I've got a piece of lace, and I use lots of lace on the other end, so there's lots of wave activity going on there. But I want this end to be a little bit more calm and subdued, so I think I'm just going to put one little narrow piece of lace here. And you'll notice that this lace, it's angling in the same direction as the shoreline, and the reason that I'm working on an angle rather than straight up and down is if the changes happen straight up and down vertically, it creates an abrupt change, but when you do it at an angle, it creates a sense of movement, and it looks like things are moving, and it also gives you more space to play with. Now I've got another piece of that beige fabric that matches the cloth that I've got on the other end, but it doesn't fit so well, and it's got a big hole in it. I can plug that hole up with another piece of fabric that I have here. Now I'm finally getting into the main part of this video, the thing that I really wanted to show you. I'm going to create the look of water gently lapping up onto the shoreline using something called a actually, I'm not sure what this stitch is called. Let's call it stacked blanket stitch. So we're going to create several rows of very uneven blanket stitch. So my first row, some of the stitches are taller than others, some of them are wider, some of them are narrower, and it's going to be very uneven. If you think of the way that water sort of gently laps up onto the beach, it doesn't usually come up in a straight line. It's sort of a jagged line, a wavy line as it comes up onto the beach, and that's the look that we're recreating here in Stitch. And I'm using white for this because when you think about the water coming up onto the beach there, it often looks like white edges on the bubbles there, with a transparent area in between. And I'll work right across my piece, generally following that diagonal line there, but meandering up and down with my blanket stitch. And this is what I mean about having more stitching in this area. So all these stitches are strengthening what we had going on below. That's why we didn't need to do many rows or very secure running stitch to start out with. Now, I learned of this type of blanket stitch from watching Mirjam Gielen or Mirjam Textiles on Instagram. And if you don't know Mirjam's work, I would really recommend that you check her out either on Instagram, and she also very generously shares on her Patreon page for a very minimal amount each month. You get all kinds of wonderful ideas from her. So I will leave a link to her Patreon for sure. I'm not sure if I can link to her Instagram and any other channels that I can find for her as well, so you can check her out if you like. It'll be in the description box for this video. So now that I've gone all the way across, I'm going to head back with another row of these blanket stitches that connect to the first row. But if you look closely, you'll see that I am slightly distorting. I'm pulling up on that cross piece off the row below to create kind of a more rounded organic shape rather than a straight line. And I'm also making this row very varied. So some of the stitches are bigger, some of them, sometimes I skip a stitch from the row below, sometimes I do 2 stitches into one of the stitches in the row below. And now I decided to add some more lace, but I just want this to be very delicate, so I've actually cut this piece in half, and I can use the 2 halves separately. And again, they're all angling in basically the same direction. They're not lined up parallel, so there's some movement and variability there, but they're all basically going from the upper right to the lower left. I don't have any of those dominant lines going in the opposite direction, pointing in the other way. So if that makes sense, right? And now I've got both of those pieces of lace secured on there, and I'm going back to the water that's lapping up onto shore, and I decided that I'm going to overlap some stitches just to create more variety, more depth, more visual interest. And you can certainly do this if you want, but you don't have to. And you can make these as uneven as you like. So in some areas I didn't go all the way across, I just went back and forth. So some areas are very tall and some areas are shorter, because that sort of organic look really appeals to me. But if you would like yours to be straighter, you can certainly do that. It's really up to you. I'd really like you to make this piece whatever you want it to be. You don't have to do exactly what I do. You can just use the things that I do as a suggestion, as an idea to make this into your own piece. And if you like that really rough crashing waves look like I've got on the other side, you can absolutely do that on both sides. Or if you, as I said before, if you don't want to create a shoreline, you don't have to. We've used this stitch before when we did the piece on coral, and if you don't feel like doing a shoreline this month, then maybe you'd like to do some more coral using this stitch. And then some of the other pieces that we'll work on this month, there'll be options for how you can do them underwater as well as onshore. So I'm just going to keep working on this piece here until I feel like I've done enough, and then I will stop and we'll go on to something else. So thanks a lot for joining me, and happy stitching this month. I'll see you again in the next video. Bye for now.